Okay, guys, let's move on to our next topic, which is looking at COVID pandemic modeling. I remember when I had Ross McKittrick on, I said, oh, gosh, I wish you were looking at the issue of how things went so wrong in the computer modeling. And he said, you know what? It's just not my bailiwick. Maybe someone else will do it. Well, we found the someone else. Dr. Harvey Schipper is both an engineer and a physician who has served as a cancer specialist, innovator, health systems designer, businessman, and advisor to government. He's currently professor of medicine and adjunct professor of law at the University of Toronto. And he's the author of a new Macdonald-Laurier Institute commentary. It's titled, if you want to look it up, How Pandemic Modeling Failed Policymakers and How to Do Better. He joins me now to talk about it. Dr. Schipper, thanks so much for being with me today.
It's my pleasure.
Let's begin by talking about how the modeling went wrong. I mean, I think we have to go back to the Imperial College and Neil Ferguson. I think that's kind of the starting point because it seems like everybody else modeled on his flawed modeling. But this isn't the first time that he had outrageous projections of deaths. He did during, I guess, BSE and the projections for Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. He did during the H1N1 crisis, and now here again. And it strikes me that these guys don't ever learn from their mistakes. And so I'm just trying to understand how did they get it so wrong? Can you tell me what went into the modeling projections or the modeling assumptions that caused it to be so out of step with what we actually observed?
Well, you've got to understand that when those early models came out, we had very little data to go on. What we had was early data coming out of China of a new pathogen, a new virus, that seemed to cause major respiratory problems, a death rate approaching 30%. And that's what we knew. Interestingly enough, that was picked up first by a Toronto startup company called Blue Dot that was using airline travel manifests and AI-based searching of local newspaper articles to identify this cluster of diseases, of illnesses that seem to have a terrible mortality rate and a great propensity to spread, both biologically and because people were flying all over the place because airplanes do that. So if you take that model, you are obligated to say, okay, what's the range of possibilities here? And if something is going to affect millions of people and have a mortality rate of 30%, then from that perspective, the Imperial College projection was not wrong. That's what we had.
An infection rate that was 3.5 times anything we'd ever seen, or 2.5 times anything we'd ever seen before. That seems to me a pretty fundamental flaw. What am I missing about why that was realistic?
Well, I wasn't part of the Imperial College modeling thing. All right. But the reality is that Spanish flu killed a hell of a lot of people, and hopefully we're not going to lose anywhere near as many people as the Spanish flu took away. But the obligation of the planner is to look at a range of possibilities. We can argue that the Imperial College one overdid it. But on the other hand, you have a real problem on the other side of the equation saying, how do we protect the public? Are we going to have some level of control? This is a new pathogen, and it's amazing, that within days of it coming out, we actually knew what it was, which is so much different even than SARS of about 12 years ago, where, it took a while to characterize it. We had this characterized quickly, and he said, this is infectious, this is dangerous, we don't know who it hits. What are we going to do? Because it's going to be here pretty quick. And
I'm still a little unclear, though. If we've never seen a virus that has infected 70% of the population, isn't that just a fundamental? Isn't that taking worst case, extreme, impractical outcome and building it into the model? You're setting yourself up for failure if you're going to start there, aren't you? What is a more reasonable amount?
Even if you wind down the number to 30% get infected, you still have millions and millions and millions of people who potentially are dead.
Okay.
All
that
right?
being said, So okay, that's fair enough. Let's move to the second level, though, because initially you'd said that the death rate was 30%. By the time the World Health Organization raised the concern, they were saying the death rate was 3.4%. So and then as we continued on looking at it in other jurisdictions, it became pretty clear it was nowhere near 3 in 100 people dying from this.
But
and so
what we were but that's a typical story of many kinds of epidemiology. If, for example, you compare it with SARS or Middle East respiratory systems, MERS kills half the people who get infected. All right? SARS kills far less. Why did we get away with it? Why did we not run into troubles beyond very local areas, of which Canada and Toronto in particular were one? Because it turned out not to be so infectious. You didn't know that at the time. Everybody was greatly concerned, but we quickly learned that one was not so infectious. But one of the things about epidemiology, about the definition of any new illness, doesn't matter whether it's a cardiac disease or something like this, is the first cases that come to light, that attract people's attention, tend to be the dramatic extreme ones. That's just the way it is. So whether it's, it doesn't matter. And then what happens, people see that, and then they start looking more closely. And typically what happens is you start with the extreme ones, then you say, well, here's some that aren't so extreme, and this pyramid, if you will, of severity becomes defined. And for some, like MERS and SARS, the pyramid is very narrow. There are very few people who get infected who don't get desperately sick. For things like influenza, the pyramid is very broad. Even though it kills in an average year in the United States 50 to 60,000 people, in fact, millions get infected. You'll learn that over time. But here's the problem you ran into, and that was you had evidence of a disease that we didn't understand that was killing all sorts of people. We didn't know who. Now we know for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, it's older people. And the mortality rate for older people is still a serious number, all right, even though it's far, far less.
Okay, so maybe my concern is that the models do not respond fast enough to new information, because I'm just going to challenge you a bit on that. In March, Ontario put a epidemiology study on about the profile of patients who were dying in Italy, and 99% of them had comorbidity factors. And it was very clear that the vast, vast majority of them were over the age of 70. And so we knew this all the way back in March, and yet we are still today acting as if it's terrifying to let school children go back to school in September, even though we know that there's very few that will die under the age of 19. You see what I mean? Like we now know more about this virus, but I'm not seeing the public policymakers make any decisions. They're all acting as if the early models were true, and at any moment we could be back at that horrible scenario.
Well, I don't think you're giving them due credit, because the issue with young children, apart from the fact that a small number of younger people get really sick and die because of some immunological work we'll sort out. Set that aside for the moment. What we don't know about young children, and there really isn't good data as recent as the last I looked, and the stuff was pouring out, it was sort of over the weekend. We really don't know clearly how effective young children are as transmitters of the disease. There's no question they get it. There's no question that not many of them get sick. But here's the problem. We know that this illness is infectious even in people who aren't sick. So your children go to school and they come home and they hug grandpa and grandma, and they don't know they're sick, but they're transmitting it to someone who is at risk. That's the issue we're struggling with. And it's a serious issue. All right, and there isn't a clearly defined answer, and it's why public health authorities and school people are really struggling to balance the issue, which takes me, in a sense, to the direction, of the commentary wrote, which says we're looking narrowly at the disease, And that's what these epidemic models do, and they're very effective, and they give good guidance, and we've saved all sorts of lives doing it, and we've developed strategies for treating things and vaccinating things based on that. But when an epidemic is of such broad impact that, for example, you end up reallocating health resources, so say cancer treatments are deferred, we really have to expand that model to look at things like all-cause mortality and make those balancing questions or decide where we've got to add extra capacity if this happens, rather than in the narrow focus of the particular pathogen. And then you go beyond that and you say, okay, we're going to look at all-cause mortality, and we're also going to take into account the heart attacks that don't get treated. But then what about the broader impact, the social impact of people losing jobs, of being cooped up in small apartments and maybe becoming depressed and having mental illness problems? You've got to start looking at this more broadly, because that also leads the opportunity for more effective solutions to it.
Dr. Schipper, let me just make sure that we're kind of operating on the same set of facts, because I'm going back to the New England Journal of Medicine that Dr. Fauci authored about 2 months ago, where he looked at as we were getting more testing done, more evidence that there was asymptomatic infection. He said that this is likely to have a death rate between 0.1 and 0.4%, similar to either the regular flu or the bad flu season of 57, 58, and 68, 69. Are you operating on that same set of information, or am I missing something?
No, that may well be where we're going. It's actually a little more. It's like a really, really bad flu season. Typically flu is about 0.1%. And this is, 0.4, 0.5. But the other piece of it is the infectivity of it. All right. So 0.1% of 1,000 people is tiny. 0.1% of 100 million is a lot. And that's why you're starting to see the death rates you're starting to see, because a lot of people are getting infected. And we're only beginning to peck away at how you minimize the morbidity and mortality of those who become infected.
Okay, let me make sure we're on the same page on another piece of information, though. Quite different if that 1,000 people you're talking about who get infected are over age 70 with comorbidities, or under age 65, which is the working age population. If you get more people under age 65 infected, you're going to have a lower death rate. Whereas if it's over 70 in nursing homes, you're going to have a massive death rate, as we've seen in Quebec.
Well,
so shouldn't that matter too?
We sure learned that, and exactly, and that's where our learning came. Remember, it was only about 2 weeks ago that they had a kind of macabre 6-month anniversary of knowing this bug existed. And by this point, we've understood that the principal target are people with gray hair who are collecting Canada Pension, right? Those are really vulnerable people. And it's not just because they're in nursing homes, but that raises a very interesting question about expanding the horizons of the pandemic model, allowing you to cut the disease. All right. Why were all these older people in nursing homes getting into trouble? Well, we don't have all the answers yet, but part of it was clearly the physical nature of their environment. Some of them were in 2 to a room or 4 to a room. You had people who were moving back and forth from one infected person to another without even knowing it was an infection. There was food contamination. There's an interesting nugget out of Wuhan. I'm not sure if it's absolutely true, but it's very suggestive, having been in that part of the world. A lot of the apartment buildings in Wuhan where people got sick, firstly, they were small, they didn't have good air circulation, but they also, strangely enough, didn't have those little siphons under the sink, the trap, that kept a bit of water there so that fumes and vapor from the wastewater wasn't siphoned back up into the atmosphere. And it turns out, they said a lot of them didn't have that. There's an example of where a broadened pandemic model that looks at all of these kind of things up front starts to give clues about how you can intervene.
And it's a good point. I mean, we're having this debate, and it's playing on the news. People are outraged at a bunch of people enjoying the beach at Sylvan Lake. And my view is, I don't really care if they're enjoying the beach at Sylvan Lake in their family cohort. If the real problem is the items that you've mentioned, we've got to find a way to use the epidemiology evidence to target our actions to the things that are going to save the most lives, don't we? And that's what I find the disconnect being.
Well, that's right. But what we have now, one of the debates that's going on right now, Danielle, is around masks, because is this droplet or aerosol? And it's become both a scientifically and politically polarized debate, because there's supposedly a black and white difference between droplets and aerosol, where in fact it's a gradation. If the droplet gets small enough, it's an aerosol. If the aerosol gets big enough, it's a droplet. But we're now having seen that the principal means of transmission is fairly close contact. But we're also learning how infectious it is. So we've got to look at the, if you will, the less intense forms of exposure. And that's where the masks come in. If we're going to cut down infectivity, and these are just conjured numbers, so don't quote me as being definitive. We're going to shut down infectivity by, say, 70% by social distancing, washing hands, and being outside. We've got another 30% to go. All right, and what do we do to cut that is socially tolerable, to use the broadest kind of definition? Well, we obviously can't shut down the whole economy to do it. I mean, there's a truism, and that is that the way to stop COVID dead in its tracks once and for all is for every single human being to self-isolate for 6 weeks. Well, you can't do that. All right? So you go to the beach, and we've now got data coming out of the states where they've both got more data and a whole range of public policy, and there are bursts of infectivity and illness in young people associated with going to the beach.
Doctor, you were just talking about the incidence of infection that we've seen from the United States. I want you to finish that thought, and then I'll see. I guess I'm finding that I'm not agreeing with you, and so I want to just see if we can end this interview on a path of agreement. So tell me what your point was.
Well, the point was that you've got a lot of people getting infected, and they're young people dying because so many are getting infected, and it's a rare event. But Danielle, I'd like to leave a thought on which we'll both agree that we didn't get to explore, and was really the central thrust of my paper, and that was that this country, for a whole bunch of reasons, is in a unique position to be the global leader in thinking about how we better address these things in the future. And that's not simply a lovely academic and policy thing. It has very significant economic implications and positive implications also for our healthcare system.
I take your point, but here's where I'm coming from, is that if you put absurd parameters into the model and come up with 5 million people in Canada are going to die, even if you try to look at these other parameters and saying, well, look at the cancer deaths, look at the heart deaths, you've already inflated the number of people who are going to die from some unknown virus, so you'll be able to dismiss any of the arguments people are making about the trade-offs for this. And this is why I think it's really important.
Hardly. When you get that data out there, you set it in a much better perspective. You raise the issue, of competing kinds of things. If you're simply looking at all-cause mortality as compared to simply COVID in this particular instance, you come up with a different mix, a different kind of communication. That doesn't get away from the need to mitigate as best you can the risk of COVID. And the opportunity for Canada, because we have the range of talent and infrastructure, we can actually be very sophisticated at doing that, and we're leading at doing that, and make a hell of a lot of money in the process, and in fact protect our citizens even better. I think we've actually done a very good job. But
fair enough. But I still. What I still don't understand is why the treatment of this virus has been so different. I mean, I've been looking, we stopped testing for influenza when this ended up overwhelming the labs, and yet we had a really deadly flu season, influenza B, for young people, where in America, where they didn't stop testing, there was 166 young people who died of influenza. We're not even talking about that. And when we've had influenzas, we've not talked about masking children or having them go to school in alternating ways. And yet we are on this one. That's what I'm frustrated by, is it seems like no matter how much new information we get, we're still acting as if the initial models were true.
So one of the interesting things, a piece of data that came out from the United States 2 or 3 weeks ago, is that the regular flu season seemed to have been shut down almost as if by a door in mid-February as people in the United States started to react to the pandemic. And that was not because people weren't being tested. The testing for influenza in the States was not changed in any particular way. It wasn't as comprehensive as this. But, you know, there's an example. And one of the interesting things is, of course, if you do what the Japanese do and your culture is more socially distanced, masks, bowing instead of handshaking, compulsive hand washing are all, in a sense, part of Japanese culture. Each year they get bashed far less with the flu than we do in this part of the world. That's a cultural thing. And these are the things you want to take into account. You know, yeah, we reacted very dramatically to this, and I think we were justified, in part because we didn't know, and in part because as the evidence presents itself, it is still considerably worse than the flu, and particularly in places that aren't able to provide adequate health supports if things get out of hand and, you know, hospitals overwhelmed and all the rest. So you need this kind of signaling. You need consistent language so that you pick up the signals early. You know, within 3 or 4 years, I'll bet, and this is just knowing a little about what genetic profiling is going to be doing, it won't surprise me if the basic scientists are going to be able to look at a viral molecule, identify it very quickly, and determine how likely it is to be infectious. What are the targets going to be? We may be able to do that before it even hits the people. You know, we're starting to be able to do that with some of the big data genetic modeling that's out there. You want to have those technologies in place because these things are going to keep arising. They've always been there. They've been, the biggest one we know about was 1918. But you've got to remember that bubonic plague, the Black Death, wiped out 25 or 30% of the population of the world at the time. That was a long time ago. And by the way, you know, the treatment there was not an antiviral or an antibacterial. It was changing habits. And of course, the famous one was cholera in London in about 1850, where it was raging through the community. And somebody went around, and John Crow is his name, and John Snow, and went around, mapped out carefully where the people got this, and said, wait a minute, there's a contaminated water pump. Shut down the pump. The cholera epidemic ended. It's a really good example of broadening your horizon and looking at the mechanism. Shut down cholera without treating a single patient.
Then let me ask you, with this new model where you look at measures of all-cause morbidity and mortality, measures of culture, geography, physical structure, measures of economic impact, and then you also talk about a lexicon of common language, what would be different? Let's go back to March. What would have been the different menu of options before policy, in front of policy decision makers at that time if this new model had been in use?
Let's set aside the prospect of picking it up genetically and predicting its targets even before they get to people. Let's just set that aside, because if that comes, it obviously very much changes the game, right? Firstly, you say, okay, what is the frequency of this illness that's caused concern? All right, how often is that happening right in the local area? Can we get precise data, more precise data, very quickly in the area of who is being affected? Let's just say we had that data earlier and that people were able to respond more quickly rather than standing back and saying, hey, it's far away, it's distance, then already you could have gone to retirement homes and say, hey, we've got a virus or a bug or something that's coming through here, and we're getting early signals that you guys are at particular risk. Let's get some precautions in those places quickly. Let's not wait till the first cases hit. And if you want to get an example of how that works, look in jurisdictions, even look in BC where they missed it at the beginning, but then Bonnie Henry was right on it. All right? So you say,
and we were only a few weeks behind her, which is why, again, even though the majority of our deaths were in nursing homes, we still had a very low number of deaths because we kept it out of most of our nursing homes in Alberta.
Right. But and the other thing you learn, look, with the 1918 pandemic, the reason it spread so slowly is because communication was slower. People had to take a boat to get home, right? Here you get on an airplane, and in a few hours, what was in Wuhan is in Calgary. Right? So, not only do people travel faster, information travels faster. So back to the Blue Dot story in Toronto, they picked up the information that they had a bug. Here's where the people were traveling to various places. Blue Dot could tell you that 18 people left Wuhan on this particular day, and they ended up in these places sitting beside such and such people on an airplane. And had we really been attuned, and there are privacy concerns here, but had they really been attuned, you might have been able to shut this down sooner because we had the information, to let people know. We had the common language that allowed the communication to happen. We got over some of the political hurdles of, geez, I'm going to be embarrassed if I tell you we missed these cases. So I'm hearing you kind of reject the Swedish approach, which is protect the vulnerable population, but knowing that we're likely not to have a vaccine for a long period of time, allow the low-risk population to have higher infection rates so you can get to herd immunity that way. I'm gathering that your approach is stop it in its tracks as opposed to have the managed flow and just make sure it doesn't overwhelm our hospitals, because there are two different models emerging here. Yeah, well, so I've actually sat in on some of the Swedish talks, and they're a bit misrepresented. Any epidemiologist will tell you that if you have the ability, if you think you have the ability to shut it down, then you shut it down. And that's kind of what we were able to do with SARS and MERS. If you don't have the ability to shut it down, then how do you strike the balance of keeping the economy going, personal freedoms, and all the rest against death? And the Swedish made a slightly different decision. And they basically said, I want to keep this economy going. I need to protect older people. And one of the interesting pieces of protecting the older people that the Swedes chose is everybody says they kept the schools open. That's not the case. They had the high schools open, but the elementary schools and kindergartens were closed. Why? The elementary schools and kindergartens were kept open. Why? Because who were the caregivers of the kindergarten kids but the grandparents? And otherwise, they were going to be exposed. Now, only time will tell. Their death numbers are higher.
But lower than Quebec. Like Quebec did lockdown, but Quebec did a terrible job keeping it out of the nursing homes.
Well, they sure did. And as a country, we did worse with nursing homes than most anybody else. And I don't think Ontario earns a hero's badge either. But 3 or 4 years from now, we're going to look down the line with all of these changing variables. Do we have a vaccine? Do we have better treatments? Do we have all these things? We're going to have a sense whether the Swedes are right. Right now, they've had more deaths than others.
In the area.
A year or so from now, in a year or so from now, that may be different. If there's no second wave, they're going to look foolish. If there's a huge second wave, they may look less foolish. Who the hell knows? And maybe even the Americans, with what's going on now, looked at 5 years from now, they'll say, well, we got herd immunity or something. Nobody knows. And that's where one needs to be, cautious, and where my concern that, we can't prove it, so we can't act on it, can be hazardous, because The only thing I know for sure, Danielle, is we don't know it all. And it changes by the hour. And making policy in this kind of situation is really difficult.
All right, we'll leave it there. Dr. Harvey Schipper has written an article, How Pandemic Modeling Failed Policymakers and How to Do Better Next Time. And I guess that's just it. We'll have to look back on it 5 years from now and see who got it right. Well, I didn't expect that conversation either. Someone says, Dr. Schipper's not quite what I expected from your introduction. He sounds like another COVID disaster proponent. Lots of anecdotal stories and no facts. Well, this is the problem. I think that the entire epidemiology and computer modeling profession is a catastrophe. And I don't think that there's actually any real analysis going into how do you refine models as you go so that you can build in real world observations. It seems like even look what happened here. Even when we got down to the least case scenario, what did we hear from Dr. Hinshaw? Well, the model isn't really designed to work to show reality. It has to build in this peak, and we never ever reached even the lowest case scenario here. So I will keep searching, friends, but I'm not really seeing that there's much soul searching going on in that field. I think that there is still let's get the most extreme outlier and promote that as if it's going to happen, regardless of what real world data shows. Kind of sounds like what happens on the climate change modeling, doesn't it? That there needs to be a complete shakeup in this entire field. And for me, what matters is what you actually observe with your own eyes. So anyway, we continue on. Tina, go ahead. What's on your mind today? Oh, we're going to go to James first. James, go ahead. What's on your mind today? Have we got him?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, James. Try again.
COVID or COVID-19, this pandemic, there's so many things that it's really highlighting that are sort of wrong with our society, at least from my perspective. Two of them, I'll just bring two up here. Neil Ferguson with his computer modeling. This hack has been around for decades, and he's been wrong almost all the time. And it's fascinating and both frightening to me how one person can have such an impact on so many people, just masses of people. Thomas Sowell made a great comment. He said, it's hard to imagine a more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong.
And when you look Can I just comment on something there, James, as well? Because he ended up losing his job, not because he was so dramatically wrong on his epidemiology models, but because he snuck out to see his mistress in violation of the very policies that he was advocating government implement. And so there will be still no accountability for how dramatically wrong he got the epidemiology this time as well.
Well, yeah, he was wrong. But what's scary is the profound ripple effect that had. The just throughout the world, all the people who've lost their businesses or closed their business for this long time, all the unemployment, and it's just amazing when you think about how this one person who went in with a biased approach towards his conclusions and everything, and then that takes you to the leadership. And how the leadership, there really isn't leadership. They just folded because they were more fearful that they might be wrong. All their advisors were saying, like with the Prime Minister of England, if you're wrong here, you'll go down in the history books as the guy who let 1 million people die in England because of COVID-19. So I just find that stuff fascinating, but it's also scary because, the masses just go along and accept all of the stuff that's fed to us. And then I'll just leave you with Bertrand Russell, the great mathematician philosopher from England. He said, the fact that an opinion has been widely held is no evidence that it's not utterly absurd. Indeed, in view of the silliness of the majority of mankind, a widespread belief is more likely to be foolish than sensible. And then that takes you to, I've heard nobody talk about the importance of building and keeping a great immune system for yourself, because that's what it all gets down to. You have a good immune system, you're not going to get very sick throughout your life. And nobody's talking about that. Nobody's underlining it. Nobody's talking about how we're a part of this thing called planet Earth. We're part of nature, and nature's self-healing. And if you're just kind of looking after yourself in the right ways, this COVID-19 is not going to be bringing me down. Let me put it that way.
Oh, James, I always like your insights, and thank you for calling in, giving us a couple of inspirational quotes as well. Guys, I told you about this this new series that I've been watching called The Explained. There's a really interesting one, incidentally, November 2019, talking about pandemics. You know what I think happened? I think everybody freaked themselves out into thinking that the Bill Gates model of a SARS or MERS style disease was going to happen. Then when this one emerged, they said, aha, this is it. And they suspended all analysis to see whether or not that was actually true. In any case, one of the factoids that came out of this November 2019 18-minute little mini documentary, I recommend you see it, is that there's 1.2 million viruses in the animal community that have the potential to have a crossover into the human environment by having a crossover species. And they explain how that might happen. 1.2 million. So what does this mean, friends? Like, we can't live under a constant state of fear. I think James is absolutely right. We keep forgetting there's this thing called an immune system that keeps the vast majority of us safe from any of the microbes that would attack our systems. And he's absolutely right. Why don't we hear more doctors and epidemiologists and scientists and politicians talking about that? We never do. And so that's where I'm concerned, is that it seems to me like there is just a doubling down, that this is going to be the new way. Every time a new virus comes about, it's lock down the economy, run people out of business, and then try to justify it afterwards on the basis of, oh my gosh, here's what the worst case scenario could have been. And that, I don't think, is a very healthy way to live. Let's go to Steve first. Steve, go ahead. What's your thought today?
In an emergency, if you break the first rule, don't panic. The next 9 rules don't amount to a hill of beans. Mm-hmm. It's not going to happen. Now, in statistical modeling, as soon as you start to form an opinion, all new data coming in gets colored. You start to give more weight to that which you agree with and dismiss that which you don't. And I think the biggest problem with statistical modeling, if you don't have the ability to have a cold, dispassionate point of view, meaning you have to eliminate the entire human experience of you tend to move and gravitate toward that which you agree or like. And the only time I saw, I'll finish with this, where the entire planet got it wrong, but one lady, Ann Coulter on Bill Maher, she was asked, of the Republican declared candidate, who has the best shot of becoming president? And she said Donald Trump, because she could see through all the fog. And she saw it so clearly, and she was spot on. And when it comes to COVID,
I think I saw that clip, Steve, and when she did, I think the hosts all laughed at her.
Oh, they're absolutely incredulous. But the thing is, when it comes to statistically with COVID and that, is once you start to gravitate toward one end, like when the Italian doctor who's an expert said, this is starting to lose steam. I just heard the Mexico government say the same thing. They won't accept that as new data because they're married to what they've been saying for the last 3 months.
Steve, right on. That's my biggest complaint, is I have no problem if you start off with a model that is inaccurate as long as it becomes more accurate as you go along. And my concern is that none of this was news to us, right? I was sharing with you the same observations as they came up. So if I was able to see back in March the comorbidity issue, the over 70 issue, like why couldn't the epidemiologists see that? And why couldn't they refine their models? This is what I don't understand. I'm just a radio host, for heaven's sakes. They're the ones who should be looking at the data and being able to make the modifications, and yet they seem completely incapable of it. That's my frustration. Got Jason on the line. Jason, go ahead. Your thought today.
Hey, Danielle, I was going to say, based on this model stuff, like people are upset about the way this COVID thing's going. How about climate modeling? Mm-hmm. You got 117 climate models that have been done by various countries and various government agencies around the world, and they've been done for the last, I think, since the 1980s, and they've all failed. And yet we've spent trillions of dollars on government policy, picking energy winners and losers. We've indoctrinated children. We've created fear. And we found out that, hey, look, when we run the models with all the wonderful assumptions we have about CO2 and the climate, oh, gee, we're wrong time and time again. So what do? We just keep on trucking.
Yep. Jason,
you're so stupid.
Jason, you're totally right. And it's the same problem, right? It's that modeling has a range of outcomes, and you have to model out the most ridiculous, absurd, extreme scenario. Just, you know what, to have the full range. But then they take the most ridiculous, absurd out there scenario and act as if that's mainstream and that's the normal one. It's the same problem, I think, that we saw in modeling across the board. And climate modeling falls into that same camp. Ross McKittrick has said as much. Last call. Let's get Brad in with the last word today. Brad, go ahead. Your thought today.
Well, we keep on saying COVID-19, but we should say COVID-1984 because it mimics exactly George Orwell's book in 1984. And I think that people would like to maybe cut off their nose despite their face that they keep on embracing this. And it's actually COVID-19 is more of a boogeyman of viruses because it just goes on and on with no common sense.
Brad, you're right. I need to go back and reread 1984. I haven't read it for a while. Let's make that our summer homework because I think it's probably more relevant today than it ever has been at any point in history.